I took this little RX1R Mark II with me on a 4-day travel photography holiday in New York. And I'm going to tell you what I learned about using this. I'm going to cover three different aspects of this. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how the camera performed in various travel photography scenarios. Then I'm going to tell you what it was like working with a fixed 35mm focal length here, because this is a fixed lens camera. You can't change it. It's not interchangeable and it doesn't have a zoom. So I want to tell you what it was like being restricted to just 35mm for travel photography. And finally, I'm going to talk about how working with minimal equipment and just carrying this one small camera changed my feeling about how travel photography and maybe even street photography might be, in terms of how enjoyable it is and how well it's worked for me. So apologies for the croaky voice during this video. I'm just recovering from a dose of flu that I picked up in New York, of course. Anyway, back to the video. Before getting into the detail of this review, I want to make just two quick points. In reviewing this little Sony RX1R, I'm not going to be focusing on pixel peeping or a lot of different metrics. I'm going to be talking about how it feels, about my experience of using it. And the second point is that I've been a professional photographer and videographer for some time now. And if I hadn't been taking my RX1R on this trip, I would have taken my professional camera, which is my A1 with this 24-70 G Master f2.8 lens. The standard would have been quite high. If the RX1R gets close to that, then it's a considerable achievement for it. Let's get into the detail. So first of all, let's talk about sharpness. I have here a few different images that I've set up in Lightroom, shot on that 4-day trip, and they are there to illustrate how sharp or otherwise this particular 35mm Zeiss Sonar lens is. This is a photograph of the cables on the Brooklyn Bridge, and it looks like there might be a slight amount of distortion, but I wouldn't guarantee it, because there's no certainty that the cables are absolutely straight in a line. They may be actually bowed a little bit themselves, so I wouldn't use this particular image for that. But if we zoom into this, you can see that the image is pin sharp, certainly at the center. As we move towards the outside, it still looks pretty sharp out here at the edges of the image. And I'm pretty happy with the sharpness that this lens produces. Just zooming back to the full image, it certainly seems to do the job from my point of view. Here's another image that was shot in a shop, and again, if we zoom in to this, you can see that again it looks to me to be pin sharp, certainly at the center. As we move towards the outside, I'm not seeing any softness that's there. This looks pretty sharp to me. Move over to the other side, and again pretty sharp. The sharpness of the image is important, because sometimes when you're using a 35mm lens and you don't have the opportunity to use a longer lens, you may want to crop in a little bit. And here's an image of this little skeleton sitting on the fire escape outside a building. He's lost his Santa hat a little bit, but the important thing about this image is that if I go into the crop mode, you'll see that I have just really selected the very center part of the image, and that meant it needed to be really pin sharp in order to do that. So sometimes you can rescue a situation. If the lens is sharp enough, you can crop right in. Here's another example. This was shot on the Staten Island ferry, and we were going past the Statue of Liberty, and here you can see the Statue of Liberty looks pretty sharp. But again, this is a major crop in on the image that was actually shot. So the lens is really useful from that point of view, and given that the camera has a 42 megapixel sensor, assuming you're not wanting to print this poster size and you just want it for social media, you can crop in a long way. And you can see on this one that I have cropped in a very long way. So in my opinion, the sharpness of this lens is a major asset. to team up with the 42 megapixel sensor and enable you to do a bit of cropping when and where you need to. And I want to talk a little bit about sensor noise in night photography. I have an image here that was shot from the Brooklyn Bridge at night time. You can see it's shot at 6400 ISO, and there is definitely noise in this image, and there's a little bit of lens flare as well. Now, I wasn't using a lens hood on this. That might have contributed to it a little bit, but in all parts of this image there's a little bit of lens flare where the brightness is shown to be smearing around. Could have been something to do with me hand holding the exposure. It wasn't desperately long exposure, but anyway, there's quite a bit of noise at 6400. Now, I'm not necessarily too worried about that because noise is very easily handled in Lightroom, especially with the new AI noise reduction. But yeah, at 6400 there is some noise from this sensor. Moving on to the next image, you can see that I have used the AI noise reduction on this, and so it appears that there's almost no noise, and the image is nicely sharp, and it also shows that it's not blowing out the highlights. When we're talking about noise though in the shadows in these images, it's important to note here that you may see in my metadata over here that this was shot with an exposure compensation of -2 EV. So that does tend to introduce some noise into the shadows, but you can see that Lightroom's noise reduction has completely handled it, and it's created a beautiful image here. Moving on to the next image, I've also done some noise reduction in this one, and again, if we zoom right into 100%, you can see that it is pin sharp and that the highlights are well preserved in it, and that Lightroom has been able to handle the noise pretty well. Going on to this image, again, this one has been shot without any noise reduction, and it's not too bad. It was shot with no exposure compensation, and therefore that means that the shadows are not as bad as they otherwise would have been. Again, we haven't blown out the highlights too much, and the image is nice and sharp. The noise is reasonably well handled given that it was shot at 4000 ISO. So it seems to me that when you push this sensor from 4000 up to maybe 6400, that's when you begin to see a little bit of noise and I suppose that we can probably forgive it for that. There's another image, but I have handled the noise with the AI noise reduction in Lightroom in that particular image. Now here's one that's shot and there's no noise reduction has been applied to this image at all. It's at 3200 ISO. It's of a platform for the metro in Grand Central Station, and you can see that this has some bright highlights that are not blown out. I have shot this with no exposure compensation here at all, so it's shot basically just neutral. But if we zoom into this, you can see that it's handled this nicely, and there's a small amount of noise shown in the shadows, but it's not really anything to worry about too much. So I think overall I'm happy with the way in which this sensor has performed at night. You're really struggling once you get to 6400 and above, and you will see some noise, but still you can deal with that noise in post-processing. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about stabilization, and the fact is that this camera doesn't have any stabilization, not for still photography anyway. It does in movie mode. It has steady shot, which will provide a crop in to the lens to something like 42 millimeters from 35 millimeters in terms of focal length, and so that allows it to do some stabilization, some digital stabilization on the image, but that is not available for still photography. Now this image, you can see here, it was 1/4 of a second exposure, so it was really quite slow. It was handheld, and I just wanted to take a long exposure so that I could blur the traffic in this yellow New York taxi passing the front of Radio City Music Hall, so that it would obscure some of the less attractive parts of the building. Now, it looks okay until we zoom in, but you'll see when we do zoom in, there is slight evidence. You can see here that it's not held rock steady. If I'd been using my Sony A1, I know that this image would have been pin sharp, and I could have handheld it at half a second or maybe a tenth of a second, something like that, without any blur at all. But this camera has no stabilization. I would like to think that if Sony are updating this camera, that they would put in some stabilization, though I do realize that putting stabilization on a sensor in such a tiny camera body could be a pretty big challenge. But either way, stabilization is something that I miss with this camera. Let's move on now to discuss dynamic range, and I have a couple of images that are useful in that respect. Let's just open up this first one. This is a picture inside St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, and as you can see, there are some shadows down to the bottom, and it's done pretty well in retaining the shadow detail, I feel. Just waiting while the picture fully loads. That's it, loaded now, but it hasn't blown out the highlights. If we look in on the highlights, you can see that they've been retained pretty well and not blown out, and yet the shadows still have shadow detail. This one also supports the fact that the image is incredibly sharp as we zoom right in on it to 100%. And then secondly, we can have a look at this image, which is a sunset. Let's zoom out to the whole image. This is a sunset looking across the Hudson from Manhattan, and you can see that the sun's just setting over here, and I've been able to shoot this without blowing out the highlights completely, shooting straight into the sun where it is setting, and yet there is still good shadow detail in the image. Certainly there are blacks right down here, but there is some shadow detail where we need it. So I'm very happy about the dynamic range from this camera. So let's have a look at the experience of being limited to one focal length. In general, I find this actually amazingly good because it enables you to look for compositions, I think, that are more naturally occurring. So I really like the lines in this particular image. And moving on to this one, I find that 35mm is really good for leading lines if you set it down onto a bench or a similar situation like that. It's also worked well for me in terms of some of the cityscape images when you get further away. This image was a 6-second image in order to smooth out the water and retain the leading lines without too much complication around them of these posts that are in the water leading out a little bit into the Hudson. So I found that 35mm created some really nice images. This one's of the top of the Rockefeller Center as the early morning sunlight was hitting it and the shadow of the buildings covering it up a little bit more down below. So I like the perspective that this gave and the way in which the verticals converge on it, and you get that quite well with a 35mm lens. And here also it was extremely suitable for shooting Manhattan as we headed over to Staten Island on the ferry. However, there are some situations in which you may want to get more width into your picture. This is an image, it's a 20-second exposure of the Brooklyn Bridge in order, again, to smooth out the water. It's a nice sharp image. If we zoom into it, you can see that it's pretty well pin sharp. But if you want to get Manhattan as well as the bridge in it, then you're going to have to do a pano. And so this is the shot that I did, which was a pano image of Manhattan, including the Brooklyn Bridge. And again, I took maybe 4 or 5 20-second exposures and put them together with the merge to panorama feature in Lightroom. And again, that creates a beautiful image. And of course, it's pin sharp at the middle. Takes a moment just to zoom into that, but you can see that that image has a lot of detail within it. And moving on now, this is the image that I showed earlier of St. Patrick's Cathedral. But if you wanted a bit more into that image, if you wanted a bit more coverage in the image, then again, maybe a pano is the way to do it. Now, this is a pano that covers more in the vertical space and in the horizontal space, and it's a great alternative if you don't have a wider lens available to you. Moving on again, this is an image inside the Oculus, and it's a very wide and spacious structure, and it requires a wide angle lens to do that, but I only had the 35, so again I shot it as a vertical pano and stitched it together in Lightroom. This is Grand Central Terminal, and again it's a pano. I've used the pano to get more height vertically, so I shot 3 or 4 images in landscape mode and stitched them together to create a degree of extra vertical height. And then if you wanted the extra horizontal width, you can turn your camera into portrait mode, and you can then shoot maybe 4 or 5 images across the horizontal. Now there are some tips for shooting panos and making them stitch together flawlessly. One is to make sure that you don't turn your body, turn the camera, because you want it to move on its own axis. If you start to twist your body while you're making panos, then you're going to get some difficulty in stitching them and maybe a little bit of distortion in the image. But overall, you can see that these panos have worked well for me. Having a high resolution sensor enables you to crop in a bit if you need to get a slightly further reach in terms of your focal length. And you can always turn to the pano technique in order to get greater width if you need a wider angle view of the scene that you're taking. So overall, I found 35 matched most of the situations that I was in, but there are other ways of dealing with it when it isn't 100% right for you. For this trip, I used the PGY Tech 1Mo sling bag. It's bigger than it really is needed for a camera of this size, but it has the advantage that you can carry your personal items along with it. And on this trip, carrying gloves was absolutely essential because it was bitterly cold. And I was also able to carry then a filter pack for the long exposures with some neutral density filters, a circular polarizer, and so on. The camera itself is really accessible, sitting in the middle pocket of the bag. It's probably worth making sure if you drop your camera into a bag like this that it's well protected. So in below the camera, there is another pocket where I stored the spare batteries, a little battery pack that stores 3 spare batteries and shows you the state of the charge for them. We'll charge them all at once. And finally, a little tripod that I've used in the past, which is an Manfrotto pocket tripod. It basically just allows you to stabilize and set up the camera on any kind of uneven surface. When I was carrying the camera not in the bag, I used the Peak Design leash, which is a fairly minimal carrier for it. The PGY Tech bag also allows you to carry personal items stored in various other compartments, and in particular there's a handy one on the top that allows you to maybe keep your wallet in it and a credit card handy if you're using that to tap in and out on the subway, for example, and also a set of tissues. One big advantage of this particular bag is that there's a very flexible compartment at the front of it, and this allowed me to store my Joby GorillaPod in it, and that's what I used to take the long exposures down at Brooklyn Bridge Park and over in New Jersey to get the long exposures across the Hudson of Manhattan. It allows you to take a pretty unwieldy kind of structure and fit it on the front of the bag. I'm not closing this one up particularly well here, but you get the idea. And once it's in the bag, it's pretty well secured and protected, and you'd hardly notice that it was there. When I wasn't using the Peak Design leash, I used the Peak Design wrist strap, which kept the camera fairly secure and made me feel that I wasn't likely to drop it. I also used that additional little hand grip that was on it. When you take that off the camera really is particularly small. You can see there that it's really tiny camera, but big enough in the hands and feels really nice. So overall, my feeling is that I totally enjoyed using this camera, and I took photographs that I never would have taken if I'd taken larger professional kit. Also, it's important to note really that this wasn't just simply a photography expedition, it was a family holiday as well. And taking this tiny camera and using it on the holiday rather than a large backpack of equipment enabled this to be much more family friendly. I think it made me more relaxed. I think it made the whole thing more enjoyable, and I would highly recommend you trying something like this and taking just one camera one lens and seeing how that changes your photography. See if it makes you more observant, see if it makes you more adaptable. Now, there are many rumours around about whether Sony will update this RX1R Mark II and introduce a Mark III, and in an upcoming video I'll give you my views on that. So if you'd like to catch that one, please like and subscribe this video, and I'll see you in the next one.